So we've established some understanding and elaborated on understanding in relationship to the basic frame of perception and consciousness, the basic story, point A, point B, and the behaviors necessary to transform one into the other. And then we shifted to the way those stories could be, simple stories could be disrupted and transformed. And then we described a meta-story, which is that process of story establishment, game establishment, frame establishment, and then disruption by some generally unexpected occurrence or sequence of impediments that are insuperable. A descent in consequence of that into the confusion that necessarily prevails when you don't know what game to play, right? What's going on here, right? And then the reestablishment of that stability, God willing, out of that chaos, and hopefully the reestablishment of that stability on firmer ground. That's the progression. There's a gentleman named Thomas Kuhn who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and it was published in the early 60s, and its pattern duplicates what we've been talking about, as does the Piagetian notion from developmental psychology of a stage transition. Now, Kuhn wasn't necessarily convinced, people debate about this, that a scientific revolution necessarily produces a theory that's better than the previous one. It can just be radically different. Piaget, when he was looking at how children develop in their stage transitions, he was a more sophisticated thinker, all things considered, I believe. Although he knew of Kuhn's work as well and approved of it, Piaget pointed out that as children develop and go through this stage transition process, the new place they land has all the features of the old place they were, but also accounts for the new information that has been incorporated, right? So that's a developmental progression, right? Hopefully, when you learn, everything you learn is one of these transformations. Now, one of the other things we discussed was the fact that these frames are nested, right? They have micro details, and they're nested in larger structures, right? So you pursue a wife, to have some children, to become a father, to be a good citizen, to play your role in the world, to fit into the mythological narrative. That's the nesting upward. And there's nesting downward. We showed how there were micro routines that were part and parcel, perceptual micro routines of everything that you do. The micro skills that a child has to learn to do something like to set the table or to clean up the room or to be a good child. Every time you learn something, a previous preconception dies and is cast into chaos and is reconstructed. This is why people resist learning, and that's a necessary thing to understand. Why would you stick with your foolishness? Well, it's because to learn something new, the amount of pain that's involved in learning something new is proportionate to the magnitude of the disruption of the new information. Now, if you're careful and alert, you can walk that line properly, and you update yourself at a rate that optimizes the relationship between the positive emotion that the transformation offers and the pain that the transformation requires. So this is why you want to stay up to date in your life and pay attention, because if you pay attention, then you can make small changes while the dragon is still this big, instead of waiting till they ball up in a massive accumulation and take you out. And that happens to people a lot. So, and your nervous system helps tune that, because the thing is, see, if you bite off as much as you can chew instead of more or less, then it's not so much terror as challenge. And then the challenge is optimized, and then that's engaging. So that sense of engagement, right, that sense, that emotional element of meaning is actually a signal from the interaction between your hemispheres, you could say, that the rate of you've optimized the rate of transformation. Now you're compelled, and it's an interesting game, right? So you want to watch for that. You want to watch, and you want to see in your life, practically speaking, you want to see where that's happening. And then you can expand that outward and have that sense occupy more and more of your life. So that's a very good thing to practice. And there isn't anything more interesting than practicing that. So you're in a frame, something new comes along, challenges your presuppositions, that produces a collapse of some magnitude, right? There's a turmoil of new information. There's a psychophysiological disinhibition as your nervous system tries to sort out what you should do next. Then there's the reconstitution of the principles by which you're going to operate. And then there's the emergence of a new frame, right? So that's the transformative story. And so there's the simple story and there's a revolutionary story. And so the revolutionary story is a higher order story because it describes how stories transform. Okay, so now what we've examined so far are the conceptual features, the concepts that you need to understand in order to begin to apprehend the symbolic language of narrative and mythology. And we established that conceptually first with regard to the nature of these frameworks, and then we instantiated it to some degree neuropsychologically, emotionally, and motivationally. So there's two converging sets of representations there, but they're isomorphic. They map onto each other in a one-to-one relationship. Now what we're going to see, and this is the clincher in some ways, I believe, is that the structure of narrative itself maps onto this underlying conceptual structure. Now, for that to not be true, that would mean that the philosophers and the neuroscientists are wrong where they converge, and so is the narrative. And the probability of that, as far as I'm concerned, is zero. There's just no way that all those different ways of looking at things tell the same story without it being true. In fact, that's how we determine what's true, is you know what's real because all your senses tell you the same thing, right? Even though they rely on 5 different measurement strategies. Now, you might discuss that with other people too, just to be sure. But that's generally how you determine what's real. Multiple variable sources of information report the same phenomenon. That's what we're trying to establish here. So now, you can think about these states as you can think about the initial stable state, the descent into chaos, and the reconstitution of new order as states or places or as a pathway, okay? All of those work from a narrative perspective. Now, if the characterization is state, then each of those elements, it's given an identity. That's another way of thinking about it. It's given a characterization. And so we're going to examine the fundamental characterizations that represent this process. And that'll take up the next 6 hours, essentially. I'll explain it to you conceptually, and then I'll show you how that actually plays out in stories. And so what you'll emerge from, hopefully, is a set of frames that will enable you to understand the deep structure of any narrative. And so that's great fun. It's great fun because you can go to a movie, especially a movie that's got like a mythic element to it, you know, a medieval adventure story or an animated movie, because they tend to tilt towards the archetypal. And you can enjoy it at the level of the movie, but then you can see, oh, I can understand the underlying structure. I can see exactly what's going on here. And that's, it does nothing to take away from the aesthetic experience of the movie. It just adds a whole other layer of understanding. That's the utility of deep literary criticism, because in a sense, that's what we're doing, is the deepest of literary criticism. Now, Camille Paglia is one of the world's foremost literary critics. She said something very interesting, which she came up with independently of me, and I'm saying that for a particular reason, because she's the only other person I've ever heard say this. So when I was training as a clinical psychologist, and when I was operating as a professor, I schooled myself very deeply in the history of religious ideas, in the psychoanalytic tradition, Freud, and more particularly Jung, and learned that pattern. Now, Carl Jung had a student named Erich Neumann, and Erich Neumann wrote 2 books, great books. He wrote more than 2, but 2 particularly great books. One called The Great Mother, and another called The Origins and History of Consciousness. And The Great Mother is the source from which I derived much of my symbolic understanding of the feminine. It's a great book. It lays out the positive symbolism of the feminine and the negative symbolism of the feminine, and it does that by comparing representations of the feminine from all over the world. And he had hoped to do that with the masculine too, but he didn't live to do that. And then The Origins and History of Consciousness, he did what Joseph Campbell did, except in a deeper way. Joseph Campbell wrote a book called The Hero's Journey, which was essentially a popularization of Carl Jung's concepts. Erich Neumann was Carl Jung's greatest student, and in The Origins and History of Consciousness, he laid out the path of the psyche as it mastered its world. That was the pathway of the hero, and he associated that with consciousness, and he nailed that. He nailed that. It's a brilliant book. It's the same book, in a way, as Maps of Meaning, and it's also the same book as a book Jung wrote called Symbols of Transformation. These are all attempts, and The Hero with 1,000 Faces, that's another book that's very similar. These are all books that are attempting to get at what I'm talking to you about today. Now, Camille Paglia said to me that had the Academy, the intellectuals, especially the French, turned to Newman and Iliade and Jung instead of Foucault and Derrida, for example, and the postmodernists, the whole history of the last 40 years would be radically different. Because the postmodernists, the fundamental claim of postmodernism, this is a devastating claim, is that there's no uniting meta-narrative. Right, and that's a very provocative claim, because the monotheistic hypothesis is that all good unites. The scientific hypothesis is that all scientific truths unite, that there's a higher order union, that there's no contradiction between truths. The postmodernists dispensed with that, and that there's almost no claim that's more radical. It leaves you with nothing but fractionated positional conflict, and often in the guise of naked striving for power or hedonistic self-gratification. It's really not good, and it's wrong, because there is a uniting meta-narrative. Well, and you know some of it now. The uniting meta-narrative is the story that describes how frames of reference transform. And so it's not a static, it's not a representation of a static situation. It's a representation of a dynamic transformation. And then the notion is that the more perfectly you embody that dynamic transformation, the better the order your life falls into, the more opportunity you can extract from chaos and possibility, the better you serve yourself in the medium and the long term, and the more other people you can integrate under the same roof. There's nothing more important than that. There's nothing more important than the debate, you could say, between the school that was established. Nietzsche contributed, Freud contributed. It was really established by Carl Jung, I would say. Jung was right, and the postmodernists are wrong. And they're wrong right to the bottom. Okay, and so what we're going to explore now is the mythological representation of the narrative of transformation. And that narrative of transformation is no different than the representation of adaptation as such. Now, here's the initial hypothesis. Societies are best united under the rubric of upward transformation. Right? What principle should be foundational? So, Nietzsche describes the death of God. Well, what was he afraid would emerge in the aftermath of that to attempt to rule? Power, that was one. Ideology, that was another. Collapse into a fractious and meaningless nihilism, right? So that's the disintegration. It's like, what principle should rule, right? Rule means unite. Well, the postmodern ethos is no principle unites. It's like, it's a foolish conception because all of your perceptions are united by an ethos, right? If what you see are tools and obstacles, for example, you see union. When I look at you, I don't see parts. You come together as a union. I can look at all of you and now you're an audience, right? And you're an audience that's playing the same game as me, at least while we're here. We see higher order unions constantly. The postmodernist insistence is that somehow that stops somewhere. It's like, where does it stop? Well, for someone like Foucault, who was an appalling person, it stopped wherever it would have interfered with whatever the hell he wanted to do next. It's sickening. And it's dangerous beyond belief. So, you know, in the aftermath of Nietzsche's proposition that God was dead, that was the notion that the highest unity had collapsed. The question has been since then, and that emerged out of the consequence of the conflict, say, between the Enlightenment and the religious viewpoint. The question since then has been, what holds together properly? Well, for the ideologues, the communists and the Nazis, that was clearly power, right? Force, I mean by power, I mean force and compulsion. Do what I say or else, right? And that is a uniting principle. It's just, when chimpanzees attempt to apply that in their own troops, they meet a very painful end. And so they might be successful for some period of time, but as soon as they show a moment of weakness, the subdominant males tear them to pieces. And human beings do the same thing. So power itself, force and compulsion, yeah, you can establish some unity out of that. And it might be better than absolute bloody mayhem and chaos, right? Maybe the tyrant is better than the failed state. You know, we haven't sorted that out exactly yet conceptually, but it's by no means optimal. So now the question would be, is there a higher order uniting principle? And if there is, what does it look like? And what is its central nature and why? Okay, so that's what we're trying to figure out now. And so there's the story. You're somewhere, something happens that strikes you to the core. You have to undergo some degree of collapse. This is what happens to the Israelites, right? This is a key and this is, you can see the relation here with the narrative. So Moses goes back to the Israelites after he is illuminated by his encounter with the burning bush. So he gets to the bottom of something because he pays attention and that transforms him. And now he's charged by God to use the words that will indicate to the people that the foundation of his authority is more reliable than the foundation of the authority of the tyrant. Right? So that's what you hope to do if you speak truth to a tyrant. You're attempting to indicate that the foundation of your thought supersedes his authority. It's a hell of a thing to do in a situation like Egypt where the Pharaoh had the power over life and death. So Moses returns to Egypt from his exile and he tells the Pharaoh to his face to let his people go. That's the famous Civil War cry. Let my people go. But that's not what he says. He says, let my people go so they may worship me in the desert. He says, Jehovah says, let my people go so they may worship me in the desert. That is not the same thing as let my people go. It's a vision of a kind of ordered freedom, right? So there's a hypothesis there, which is that it's possible to live in the absence of tyranny in a form of ordered freedom that requires subordination to an abstract good. And that's what Moses tells the Pharaoh 10 times. And the Pharaoh rejects his claims and the plagues come. And the reason the plagues come is because if you're enough of a tyrant and you don't adjust your behavior when you should, you can be bloody sure that trouble's going to come. And maybe because you're a tyrant, you'll double down, and all that will mean is that the plagues will get worse. And they culminate in the death of the firstborn. By that time, 8 plagues before, the present is devastated. The death of the firstborn, that's the future. Right? So if you're enough of a tyrant, then you destroy the present and the future. And so now, the Israelites are by no means innocent in this game. They're slaves. Okay, so now you might want to ask yourself, if you're looking at the underlying structure of a story like that, what does tyrant and slave mean? Well, you might be a tyrant. Father might be a tyrant. Your mother might be a tyrant. You might have a child that's a tyrant, right? And if you're in those relationships, then, or maybe you have a boss that's a tyrant. But you can't have a tyrant unless you're a slave. So what that means is that if you're in a relationship with a tyrant, then you're a slave. And that's always the case. And so this Exodus story is something that's always happening, right? And that's what makes it a deep story. You can think about it as a historical narrative, but it's not. It's a story about how tyranny and slavery interact and what the alternative to that is. Well, what's the modern conception of slave? Non-playing character, right? NPC, right? What's an NPC? That's a slave. You're what? Not master of your own story. You're a puppet. That's the Pinocchio story. There are forces behind the scenes that are moving you. You have no idea what they are, right? So how do you overcome that? You develop a vision of your own destiny. That's what Moses offers the Israelites, the journey to the promised land. What would work for you? What's up? Right? And this works practically. You know, there's a huge literature on this. I built a program called the Future Authoring Program that helps people do this. If you get people to sit down and write out a vision for their life, you can have anything you want in 5 years, but you got to figure out what it is. Okay, now you've got your own vision, you've got your own place to go. And maybe you want to flesh that out. You know, you could think about your friends and your family and your career and your education and all the fragments of your life. But then you can wrestle with that a little bit like you wrestle with God, and you could say, okay, what would satisfy me? Or you could do better. You could say, how would I have to lay out my life to be thrilled? That's a good target for negotiation. And then it's a dialogue. It's like, I don't know what the hell would make you happy. You know, many of us are in love with our tyrannical self-imposed misery. It's like, what's your precondition for satisfaction? That's a dialogue with what calls to you and your conscience. And then you develop a vision. You say, man, if I could get that to happen, that would be worth it. Well, then what? Well, then you're charged with, well, that's a good question. You're charged with enthusiasm, right? Entheos, that's enthusiasm. That means to be charged with the spirit of the divine. Well, why is it the divine? Well, it's upward aiming, right? It's aiming at the highest point. Conceptualize the highest point, right? And then try to bring that to bear in what you do. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, it's hard. It requires responsibility. It'll be plenty hard if you don't do it too. So you can be sure of that. So you might as well pick your load instead of having it thrust upon you. Because if the load is thrust upon you, you're a slave. Right, okay, so the Israelites are laboring under the thumb of the Pharaoh, but they're slaves. Right, and they didn't have to be. Because the slavery came about bit by bit. Right, and so now Moses invites them to leave the tyranny and demonstrates his authority and power and convinces them that departing is a good idea. They cross the Red Sea, right? And the Pharaoh's army is chasing them because he has second thoughts after he decides to let them go. Well, what's a Red Sea? Well, it's a flood of blood and chaos, right? And what does that indicate? Well, out of the tyranny, you don't go from tyranny to promised land. We already know the story. You go from tyranny to chaotic desert to promised land. So that's the structure of the story. And there's a threshold moment, and that's the Red Sea. It's like, there's no going back, folks. And how does Moses find his way across the Red Sea? Well, the story is that he parts the water. It's like if you're in chaos, you find firm foundation under your feet. And you look for that. And God's there to guide the Israelites already at that point in the form of the pillar of light at night and the pillar of darkness during the day. This dynamic play of chaos and order. The Taoist conception and the ancient Israelite conception dovetail. Now, what's the chance of that? It's like, and that's the guide. Well, of course it's the guide, because the balance between light and dark, the balance between chaos and order, between night and day, that marks the path. And so then if you're in chaos and you're in the Red Sea, you're in chaos, what do you look for? You look for that place where chaos and order are balanced so that you find stability and opportunity, right? And that is the deepest, you can think about this biologically, that's the deepest instinct making itself manifest within you. It's the most real thing. So the reductionist, materialist, atheist types dispense with subjective meaning. It's like, that's biologically absurd. You have guides from within. They're real. That sense of meaning, that is the most real thing. It is the most reliable thing. Now, to interact with it properly, you have to aim up, and you have to attempt to live in the truth, because the instinct will make itself manifest in a warped manner. The wrong things will call to you. So be careful, because there's a sin the Christians laid out, the sin against the Holy Ghost. It's unforgivable. Why? Well, there's no coming back from it. Well, if you pervert the Spirit that guides you, you're done. So that's probably the most profound reason not to lie. Don't lie, because you'll pervert your aim, and then the wrong spirits will come to you. And you do not, that's the worst thing. And you'll pay for it most when you're most in danger. And you most need to rely on your own judgment. And it won't be there. So walk carefully. Okay, so now Moses, he takes the Israelites out into the desert. Well, why? Well, they're lost. Why are they lost? Well, because they were slaves and the tyrants told them what to do. And now they don't know what to do. And so they're not very happy about that. They squawk and bitch and moan and whine and fight with each other. They're fractionated because their God, who was the Pharaoh, essentially, and deified in that manner, their God died. And now they're in the desert. And they think, Jesus, I'm not so sure about this desert. I think maybe the tyranny was better, just like the bloody Russians, pining for the days of Stalin, which they do. And so the good old days, you know, good God. And so they try to set up Moses as a new Pharaoh. And he sits as judge because they can't mediate their own affairs. They're fighting with each other all the time because there's no higher order principle to unite them. And so they ask Moses to be the judge. And he sits as judge from dawn till midnight every day. Dawn till dark every day. For who knows how long? 10 years. It takes the bloody Israelites 40 years to get across the desert. It's a few weeks journey. Why? Because if you're confused enough, you get nowhere, no matter how long it takes. Right, and so that's the meandering pathway of lost slaves. And so 3 generations, that's the idea. 40 years, 3 generations to shrug off the aftermath of tyranny and slavery. Right, so they set Moses up. And Moses' father-in-law, who's a good guy, despite being a foreigner, he's a good guy. And he comes along and sees what's going on as Moses is leading his people through the desert. And he says, you have to stop doing this. And Moses says, why? And Jethro says, well, there's 2 reasons, essentially. One is you just can't do it. It's too much responsibility for you. You've got these hundreds of thousands of people, and they're full of petty squabbles because they're all slaves. They can't regulate or won't regulate themselves. And now they bring this all to you, and you're wearing yourself, you're going to die. It's not a good idea. Too much. But worse, you're stealing their own destiny from them, and they're going to set you up as a new Pharaoh. Your people need responsibility. And this is a revolutionary concept because it's literally the alternative to the tyrant and the slave. And it's established in this story. Jethro says, here's what you do. You take your people and you get them to divide themselves into groups of 10. And each of the 10 elects a representative. And whenever anyone in that group of 10 has a fight, then he can bring his troubles to that representative and he'll sort them out. And if the representative can't sort it out because it's too complex, then take a group of representatives, 10 of them, and get them to elect a meta representative. And do that all the way up to levels of 10,000. And then if that doesn't work, then they can talk to you, but not before. That's called a subsidiary structure. It's a structure of devolved responsibility. And from then on, the principle in the Old Testament is the Jews, the Israelites, do not need a king. Why? Because there's an intermediary patriarchy, right? A structured patriarchy, a hierarchy of competence that mediates between the squabbles of the lowly and the highest possible principles. That's how the court system works. It's the same structure. Subsidiarity, that's the hallmark of that organization. And it had a determining influence on how free and abundant countries structure their decision making. Now, the rule in this subsidiary organization is you push every responsibility down that you can. So the higher you sit in the organization, the less should come your way. You want to push it down, you want to push it down to the lowest level possible. That's partly how you grow an organization, by the way. You know, you wonder how there are people who run hundreds of companies. It's like, well, how the hell do they do that? Well, they don't micromanage the cleaners, right? So they set up a hierarchy of responsibility as an alternative to micromanaging tyranny or chaos. So that's the principle of subsidiarity, a fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching in particular, but a determining discovery for the structure of well-run states. And so that's very interesting. Now, Moses is judging the people for years. So what does he learn? Remember yesterday we talked about the fact that wisdom is instantiated procedurally first. People act things out. So imagine you two have a squabble, okay? And so now I have to listen to both of you. And I have to figure out what the hell you think is going on. So I have to adopt your frame of reference. Now I have to figure out how you interpret it. And then I have to put those two things together and I have to make sense of that, which means to bring those things into unity, right? Those diverse perspectives into some sort of unity. Then I have to offer that unity back to you. I have to say, look, it looks to me like this is what he means and what he'd settle for. And it looks to me that this is what he means and what he'd settle for. And this is what I think you could offer each other that might work. And so what does work mean? It means you'll walk away not murderously enraged, and so will you. So the emergent judgment has to satisfy the situation. That's what makes it just. And now imagine you do that 25,000 times. Well, what happens to you? Well, you build up a repertoire of knowledge. You become an expert at what? Judgment? Judgment of mediating principles? Well, that's why Moses gets the 10 Commandments, right? It's like it dawns on him. Oh, these are the principles by which justice operates. These are the principles by which peace can be established. These are the principles by which collective abundance and cooperation operate. And so that's portrayed in the story. He's up the mountain. He's conferring with God in a flurry of volcanic activity and lightning bolts. Why? Because this is a big deal. And that's the revelation of the procedural into the imagistic. Right? It's like, oh my God, it's like the wolf pack woke up and found out what principles governing it. It's a massive increase in human consciousness, not only in the imagistic way, you know, this thunder and cloud that is held to constitute the event, but the actual casting of the principles into words, the establishment of the law, right? So what's the law? Well, it's a semantic representation of the procedures necessary to establish what? The order that's good or very good? That would be a good conceptualization of an appropriately just polity. It's not like we understood this. Think of where we came from. The evolutionary argument, we emerged from non-linguistic creatures. We had to figure all this out. What the hell are we doing as individuals? What are we doing as a collective? What are the principles? Well, that's all part of these great old stories. And so the slaves take on responsibility for their own destiny. And that's what stops them from being slaves. Right now, they're still beholden to the abstract principle of divine sovereignty. That's the worship in the desert. What does it mean to worship? It means to celebrate. It means to elevate. It means to aim at. It means to point at. It means to sacrifice towards. Right? To do that individually and collectively. What does sacrifice mean? To work. To offer something up. To what? To allow something to go in the service of something higher. Right? To work towards and to offer up. And that is the principle. Obviously, that's the principle of civilized comport. We have abundance because we work. Right? And why is that a sacrifice? Well, it's a sacrifice. Work is what you're doing when you're not doing, you could say, what you want to do. So that's the sacrifice. And what's the sacrifice? You're sacrificing the present for the future. You're sacrificing your whim for your future well-being. You're sacrificing your narrow hedonistic desire or your will to power for the abundance of your family and your community. Right. That's work. That's proper work. And maybe proper work no longer becomes toil because it's so imbued with significance. That's what would happen if you were pursuing a vision that would actually sustain you, right? And that's how you escape from being a slave. So that's the story of Exodus. It's the same structure. Initial frame, tyranny, right? Tyranny. There's a game that the Pharaoh and his court magicians play that the Israelites are tangled up in. It devolves into complete and utter chaos. That's the Red Sea. They're through the Red Sea and then into the desert. Well, why? Because when you drop your presuppositions, you're lost and you don't know which way is up. Right? This is so important. Not knowing this makes us deluded. For years, for example, our foreign policy doctrine has assumed that a tyranny is made of tyrants and people clamoring to be free. So all you have to do is go in, take out the head, and all the sovereign citizens, upward aiming, clamoring to be free, immediately establish a democratic polity that's productive, and heaven comes to earth. It's like, that's not what happens. You take off the tyrant, and all you have left are the slaves, right? And everything degenerates into catastrophe. Right. It's a very hard journey from the tyranny through the chaos to the promised land. Right. And everything you do is that journey. Every single thing you do. That's why the story is profoundly true. It's always happening. Right. So that's very much worth knowing. And so now you can see how that maps onto this structure, just like the fall in fact, the entire biblical narrative is one of these stories. Paradise, paradise lost, paradise reestablished. How is paradise reestablished? Under the rule of Christ. Right. That's the Bible. Now there's a reason for that. It's not an arbitrary supposition. Not in the least. It's not least. Here's a foreshadowing. Christ's passion, psychologically speaking, the story is the story of someone who forgoes power and hedonistic self-gratification entirely, who then determines to face the worst of all things aimed at the highest possible good. Right. Well, how could that be anything otherwise than the story of redemption? Because the alternative hypothesis would be, well, you could pursue power and your own pleasure a little bit, And there's lots of things you could shy away from. Suffering, death, injustice among them. And then there's malevolence, because Christ dies in the most painful possible manner, and not only painful, but humiliating. That's the worst fear. That's the fear of an agoraphobic. I will die a humiliating death. Why is that the worst fear? We don't like to have our vulnerability exposed to public display. We really don't like that. That's terror of the tyrant. You show your vulnerability and get pecked to death by the crows. The corresponding fear on the biological side is death. The combination of those is humiliating death. That's the worst form of death. That's the crucifixion. What's it followed by? Descent into hell, the harrowing of hell. Why? Because if you want to live completely, you have to face death and malevolence. And then you think, well, obviously, because the alternative hypothesis is that you get to shy away and succeed. It's like, how are you going to succeed if you shy away? And so what do you have to face? Well, what are you going to shy away from? You're not going to master anything you shy away from. Well, you're going to shy away from what's worst. That's the proclivity. Well, that's why that story is an exemplar, like an archetypal, it's an archetypal ultimate, right? Worst possible death combined with the deepest possible malevolence. Face that and prevail. That's the story. Well, like I said, generate a counter-narrative and see how well that goes for you. We also know, by the way, that the way that you fortify people, this is the way, first of all, the way you learn is by confronting things that challenge you in an optimized manner. So that's literally the pattern of learning itself, is that you step outside of your zone of comfort and you face something, some new anomaly, that's like a fragment of death and hell. That's a good way of thinking about it. And you prevail, and then you expand. And so there's a pattern to that. And then we know in therapy, this is a discovery that all therapeutic schools have converged on, right? All of them, behavioral, psychoanalytic, doesn't matter. What are you avoiding? Let's investigate it, right? Maybe we'll expose you to it behaviorally. You're an agoraphobic, you're terrified of humiliating death, because that's what agoraphobics are terrified of. You think you're going to die a humiliating death in an elevator, and so we bring you to the elevator. And we have you observe that if you voluntarily confront, you will transform. Right? So that's the human story. That's the human story. We're not prey animals. We're not prey animals. We're not frozen by the sight of the anomalous. We investigate and take the treasure, and we transform ourselves. Right? That's the bread that people, that's the heavenly bread, right? That's Christ's rejoinder to the Marxists. Man does not live by bread alone, right? But by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Well, what does that mean? It means partly that if a society is founded on the ethos of voluntary exposure and self-sacrifice, then food appears in abundance. Right. Right. You can starve in the midst of plenty, especially if you're crooked and delusional. And so the meta-ethic that delivers food to the starving masses, that's the pattern of exposure that's characterized by the Christian passion. And that's right. That's the right foundation. It has to be, unless you're willing to presume that you can master by shying away. Well, that's a preposterous claim. How can you master by shying away? Mastery implies contact and expertise. You don't develop that by not being there. All right, how are these places characterized? So this is so fun. It's so remarkable that this is the case. Well, these are the basic characters of the narrative world. So let's look at this. The outside, the very container of everything, we'll start with the conceptualization of that as the dragon of chaos. Okay, why? Why dragon? We already covered that. Dragon is equivalent to predation and danger as such, right? Fire-breathing, carnivorous, flying reptile. It's like that defines undefined place, but not perfectly, because the dragon is only something terrifying. So you need the treasure. Why? Because the realm of possibility is the realm of the dragon and the treasure. Why? Well, because you might die, but maybe you'll discover a new land. So, and that's very paradoxical. You know, how do you respond to that? Because it gives with one hand and takes with the other. So it's an ambivalent relation. Well, the hero story is the story of how you develop the wherewithal to beard the dragon in its lair and take the treasure. Obviously. And obviously that's the narrative of life. So chaos as such, like in and of itself, that's the representation. Dragon, that's Lucifer, that's Satan, that's the predator, and treasure. And that could be material treasure, could be heavenly treasure. And heavenly treasure is the treasure that guarantees the treasure on earth. Christ says, store up your treasure in a place that rust cannot attack it and it cannot be stolen. Where is that? That's heaven. Where is that? Stellar reputation. Right. Stellar reputation. That's the basis of social harmony, right? So as hunters, what did we learn? The best place to store excess meat is in the bellies of the people that hunt with you, right? That's the concretization of reputation. You know, in archaic hunting communities, hunters differ in their prowess, but even the best hunter who's alone often fails. So human beings, the men mostly, because mostly the men hunt, banded together and hunted as in groups. And the probability that as a group they would be successful was vastly magnified. Now, even as a group, there might be one hunter who was the best. So then the question is, how's the hunter who's the best in the group to comport himself when a large animal has been brought down? A mammoth, say. You know, human beings came to North America 15,000 years ago. And by 10,000 years ago, there were 0 mammoths. Right. So we're very effective with spears and clubs and weapons of that sort. All the large mammals disappeared. Right. So hunting humans, whew, nothing like that on the planet. So you're the best hunter. And so what do? You get the best cut and you tell all your friends that they'd be starving without you? It's that's not what you do. You say, it was nothing. Take the best cut. Why? Because there's always tomorrow. Right, right. So then you think, what's the best hunter? Well, the best hunter is the man who provides most reliably for his family. Well, does that mean that you're the best hunter, or does that mean that you're best at sharing? Now, there's a question. Well, maybe it means both, that you have the skill and you are unbelievably socially fluent. And then you store future provision in your reputation. Right, right. And that's the heavenly food. And why would that work? Well, even if you were in a community where everything was devastated and everything was lost, and there were people around who still knew who you were and trusted you, well, you could rebuild out of the ashes. You could reformulate. So women look to markers of wealth to identify potential mates. Why? It's not because they're after the wealth. The wealth is a marker of the ability to generate wealth. Right, it's a proximal marker for the ability to generate wealth. Well, why would you want the wealth when you could have the source of the wealth? Right, well, that's the religious invocation. Why would you settle for the wealth when you could have the source of the wealth? That's the pearl of great price that the wise man would sell everything he owns for. Right, right. Okay, so what are the characters? The dragon of chaos. What's that? Possibility itself. Possibility before you encounter it. Right, it's the ground of being itself. There's echoes of older narratives in the Genesis story. In the story of creation. God broods on the surface of the water. The water is another representation of that chaotic condition. But there are other representations of God's creation in the Old Testament. He fights Leviathan, for example, overcomes him. In the Mesopotamian creation myth, the hero god, Marduk, faces a feminine dragon like the dragon in Sleeping Beauty and cuts her into pieces and makes the world. And there's echoes of that under the story of Jehovah. He fights Behemoth, and Behemoth looks something like the monster of the state. Heroes fight dragons of chaos and dragons of order. That's a good way of thinking about it. A typical hero will take down a giant. What's a giant? It's a social system gone wrong, right? And what's a dragon of chaos? It's a chaotic condition that hasn't been ordered. And those are the two basic domains of heroic triumph, right? Up against tyranny, up against chaos. That's the fundamental division. And so the hero overcomes chaos. That's the dragon in Sleeping Beauty. Or tyrannical order, right? That's what Simba does when he goes back to take Pride Rock, the center of the world, from the Luciferian tyrant. So that's the pattern. Well, why? Because that's how the world is ordered and renewed. That's how the world is created, ordered, and renewed. And so if you live that pattern, then you're living the pattern by which all other patterns are generated. Right, that's a good trick. Okay. Chaos and possibility as such, that's the dragon of chaos. Okay, then you get the next layer, and this is where the feminine comes in. Why? Why would it be primary in that way? Well, the feminine is what gives birth to. So that's an element of what's primary. And the feminine is what nurtures and destroys. Right? And so, well, why destroys? Well, because what nurtures in excess can rapidly become what destroys. That's the evil queen, right? That's the Oedipal mother. That's the pathology of human dependency, right? There's no force more potent than maternal love, and no spirit that can go more cataclysmically wrong, right? Why is the feminine chaos and destruction? Because men have to face the feminine. And what does the feminine do? Selects. It says yes and no, right? The evolutionary hypothesis for our emergence from the shared ancestor of chimps and human beings was female sexual selection. Right? Right, because human females are choosy, right? Chimp females aren't. They'll mate indiscriminately. The dominant males have a better chance of mating because they chase the subordinates away, but it's not a consequence of female choice. Female humans have concealed ovulation, and they're choosy, right? And so sexual selection and natural selection, that's what selects. And most biologists have concentrated on natural selection, but Darwin knew that sexual selection was a potent force. And that's so interesting. I know exactly why the bloody materialist biologists have only concentrated on natural selection. Because if you concentrate on sexual selection, you have to admit that consciousness shapes evolution, right? There's no place where consciousness shapes evolution more sharply than mate selection. Butterflies can detect a deviation from symmetry of 1 part in a million. Right, that's butterflies. Well, look how beautiful they are and how perfect they are. I saw a butterfly. There's a kind of butterfly. It's so remarkable. When its wings are closed, it looks exactly like a dead leaf. Natural selection. And when it's open, it's unbelievably beautiful. Sexual selection. Right, it's perfect. And you think about all the choice that went into that, all the choice and selection that went into that display of beauty to attract a mate. A mystery, that's a biological mystery. It's like, why do you know that pufferfish make sculptures? This is insane. These little pufferfish, they've got these little fins. They're not good for anything. They go down to the bottom of the ocean where there's light, and where it's sandy. And they make these sculptures that are like 30 feet across. And basically they're concentric circles, undulating waves. And they go down there with their little fins, and they make like hills, and they separate them, and then they rise up in the water like 15 feet above, and they cast one eye down, and they think, oh God, like, is that going to attract her? And if they don't, they get down there and they take shells and junk out of the sculpture with their mouth, because that pisses them off, and they know that's not going to go anywhere. And then they make these huge sculptures, and that's how they attract a mate. You know what bowerbirds are? Bowerbirds, they're remarkable too. They go, I believe they're jungle birds, if I remember correctly, jungle-dwelling birds. In any case, they make these artistic displays. They make these bowers, which are kind of like a nest, but they don't have any function except aesthetic. They make these beautiful weavings, and then they make a front yard, and they decorate it with like blue flowers or bottle caps or whatever the hell they can find. They arrange that very artfully, and they construct an entrance, like a likely way a female will come to visit, to optimize the view of their production. And some bowerbirds will knock another bowerbird out of its construction. But the female evaluates the male bowerbird not only on the beauty of what he's created, but on whether or not he can dance appropriately in that place. And the usurping birds, the thieves, don't have a dance that's well matched to the creation. And so, sexual selection. Well, why is the feminine nature, Mother Nature? Mother Nature is what selects, right? And it's a vicious selection process, because it might mean not you, buddy. That's what men face every time they face a rejection from a female. It's like, you could probably live, but you're not going to replicate. Right. That's nature. That's part of the reason, by the way, by when the evil queen turns into the dragon. So what happens in that sequence in the Disney movie is the evil queen turns into the dragon, and she litters the landscape around the castle of Sleeping Beauty with these immense plants that are all thorns. That's right. There's plenty of thorns to fight your way through to deliver the kiss that awakens the princess. Right. Why? Because she wants to see if you could bloody well do it. And if you can't, then it's the evil queen that's in your way. But it's not really. Like, is it the evil queen or your own insufficiency? And the right response to that for men always is, yeah, it's you. Right. Seriously. Right. So, okay, so that's the feminine. And there's a positive element, Sleeping Beauty. There's a negative element, the evil queen. That's what? Creation and destruction. Right. And so that's the first, you could say that's the first characters that emerge out of the abyss of the dragon. So that's actually the unknown as you encounter it. You know, you could think of the unknown as such. That's a place. It's the place of possibility. The unknown as you encounter it is whatever's actually in your way. Right? Those are different things, right? Because when something gets in your way, it's not completely unknown anymore. It's at least known as an obstacle, right? Imagine the hypothetical place of all obstacles. Okay, that's the dragon of chaos. The hypothetical place of all obstacles and all treasures. That's the dragon of chaos. It's abstracted, but it represents the structure of existence itself, insofar as existence is constituted by limitation and opportunity. Right? So it's the most fundamental concept. That's a good way of thinking about it. It is literally the possibility that God broods on at the beginning of all things. Right? It's the ground of being. It's potential, negative and positive. And it's in its experienced guise, it takes on a feminine character. Now, why? Well, evolution is a conservative process, you know, and we can tell the difference between male and female. Creatures without nervous systems can tell the difference between male and female. There likely is no more fundamental division than male and female, because any creature that can't make that distinction doesn't exist. So insofar as our conceptual systems are grounded in social and biological reality, the categories of male and female are there a priori to structure everything else we see. And so you could say that the chaos-order dichotomy is fundamental, but the Taoists immediately place a sexed interpretation on top of that. Why? Because the human imagination uses the a priori categories of perception, male and female, to represent something abstracted. Well, of course that's how it works. It couldn't work any other way, given the importance of that initial biological categorization. And so you see that very clearly in the Taoist view, where you have chaos and order, and you have feminine and masculine as the same thing, right? And that's reflected in hemispheric structure as well.